there's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamma Mia podcast.
Mamma Mia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters this podcast was recorded on. It's a regular Tuesday evening in Sydney in July 2017, and Tracy Hall is getting worried. She hasn't heard from her boyfriend of 18 months, Max, since early that morning. In her rush to get her daughter Asha to gymnastics camp, it's the school holidays, she missed a morning phone call from him. But she hasn't heard back from him since, despite multiple texts and calls.
You okay, babe? I'm worried about you.
She writes at 7 p.m. Nothing.
Please tell me you're okay.
She writes at 8:14 p.m. No reply. Maybe he's hurt. She starts to worry, frantically Googling Max Tavita shark attack into Google. He's a keen surfer. What if he got taken? After a restless night's sleep, Tracy awakes to no messages from Max. Something is not right. He always messages. He'd never just ghost her like this. She calls the police and asks them to do a welfare check. She tries to call his brother-in-law, his surfing mate, anyone she can think of from his life. Then, her phone rings. It's not him, it's her friend Kath. Trace, she says, I'm going to send you a link to a news article and then I want you to call me back straight away. Hands shaking, Tracy opens the link. She sees Max in handcuffs being led out of his Bondi apartment. Except his name isn't Max. It's Hamish McLaren. And as Tracy is about to find out, he's one of Australia's most successful con men. I'm Gemma Bath, and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamma Mia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. Hamish McLaren has been known by multiple names. Often, he'd just change his last name, but with Tracy, he changed his first name too. His ability and skill in being able to assume various personas allowed him to defraud victims of their money for more than 30 years before he finally saw the inside of a prison cell. He was convicted for sophisticated romance and investment scams against 15 victims to the tune of $7.6 million. But it's believed he swindled many more than that, and that the actual amount he stole is more likely to be between 60 and 100 million. Tracy was his last victim. In total, she handed over $317,000 before his dramatic arrest. But he didn't just financially destroy her. He made her fall in love with him. And when it all came crashing down, single mum Tracy was left psychologically and emotionally broken. In 2024, she wrote a book called The Last Victim, detailing her story, and she joins us now. Tracy, in 2016, at the age of 40, you joined a dating app. Well, where were you at in your life when you decided to make that decision?
Well, to set the scene, I had been separated from my husband for just over a year, and earlier in that process, I'd moved my daughter and I out of the family home into an apartment near the beach. And I'd spent that year sort of getting myself on track again. And it was early 2016 and I wasn't looking for another husband. I wasn't going to have any more children at that point. And I just thought, you know what, I'd really like a companion. Mm-hmm. I'd really like someone who sort of shares my morals and values and someone who I can just spend some time with on the weekend. And so I decided to start online dating. I didn't want to be alone for the rest of my life. So that's where I was. I had a really big job at eBay. I was working in the city. I had a big team. I was busy. I was stretched. My daughter was 5.5, 6, and she was in full-time childcare at that point.
Do you remember Max's profile?
Well, I do remember that he wasn't wearing a Von Dutch hat and posing with a sedated tiger in Thailand, which most of
Weird.
I know, I mean. He just had photos of him doing the things that he loved, like surfing and running and hanging out at the beach. I remember he had, you know, a megawatt smile. He had National Geographic blue eyes and, you know, the blondest hair I'd ever seen. And he just, like, to me, he just looked pretty normal, like pretty Aussie. And so that's what caught my eye.
What was his kind of origin story? Obviously, you got to chatting.
Yeah.
What did he tell you about his background?
What he told me was that he was orphaned at the age of 6. So his parents died in a plane crash, and at that time he had two older sisters that weren't capable of looking after him, and he was put into the foster system. And he was sort of shuffled around in the foster system for most of his sort of early childhood, and then he landed with a family in his teens that he met through school that had 3 boys, and he became the 4th son, is what he told me. So he ended up living with them and sort of growing up with them. So that was what he said about his childhood. And then, you know, it kind of went on from there. He was picked out because he had an incredible mathematics brain. He said that there were people that had, you know, really focused on him, and, you know, there was an offer from Mensa and, you know, a whole bunch of things like that. So these sort of bits of information came over a long period of time. And, you know, in retrospect, you put the story together, but the information came slowly, bits at a time.
I found it really interesting to read that even with that very early story, there was a little kernel in your brain that thought to Google.
Yeah.
Plane crash, Max, and his last name that he told you was his last name, and nothing came up, but you didn't think anything of it at the time.
No, well, I did think it was strange, and I think it is pretty normal when you meet someone, they tell you things or you do a little bit of sort of sleuthing yourself and, you know, there's generally things on the internet about people, whether it be their work history or some football team they played it, you know, when they were younger or whatever. But yeah, I did Google some of the things that he told me and nothing came up, and I thought, well, maybe I've got, you know, the spelling of his surname wrong or something's, you know, I've got the date off or whatever. And I think the other thing to note is often I'd Google really late at night. So we'd been out on a date and, you know, I'd got home, it might be 11:30. I'm absolutely dog tired and I'm trying to Google some of the stuff that he'd tell me. And couldn't find anything. And then by that stage, I was just falling asleep. So phone goes on the side table and off I go to sleep and start again the next day doing everything I needed to do. So I think that was a really interesting thing in retrospect, was because there was a vulnerability there because I was stretched, I was tired, and I had a lot on my plate. So I didn't go to the level of detail and question, you know, what I should have.
But also you don't think to question when someone's telling you about their life.
No, especially when you meet somebody. You know, if I met you and you said, "Hi, I'm Gemma. I'm a podcaster now, but I used to be a criminologist at a university in Adelaide," there is nothing inside me that would say, "Oh, hang on, let me just check that because I don't believe you." That's just not how we operate.
No.
And we take people on face value because when you don't suspect anything, why would you, you know? And when you don't have that level of deceit in your life or you've never come across it, it's not something that you automatically think about. I mean, I do now. I question everything. But previously, I'd never met anybody like him and I had no reason, absolutely no reason to disbelieve what he was telling me.
What was he like to date in those kind of early days?
It was fun, you know. He's a larrikin. He had a great sense of humour, awesome stories. We grew up in Australia around the same time in the 70s. And so we had a lot of kind of cultural references that we could draw on, you know, those sort of funny conversations you have about ads that used to be on telly or, you know, different things you'd wear or where you went on your summer holidays in caravan parks and all of that kind of chit-chat that we'd have. He was really active. So we were always doing things. So we were paddleboarding or we were running or we were surfing or we were walking, lots and lots of outdoor activity, which I absolutely love. So the early days, it was fun and he was an incredible communicator, a great listener. And so our conversations were very long and detailed and, you know, intimate in a lot of ways.
Like the plane crash story, he kind of had a lot of strange stories or kind of, I guess you could call them fantastical stories, like, you know, 9/11.
Yeah.
He was involved in that.
Yeah. The stories were big. And what I've come to realize with, compulsive liars essentially is you make the story so big that you can't not believe it. And you can't question. And the 9/11 story, for example, that came over a cup of tea. And it wasn't just I was in New York and under the building when the second plane hit. It was a very lengthy, very detailed story that had names and levels and company names and surnames and wives' names and what role they had within the company, what floor they worked on, how he knew them, like all the things that he listed within this big fantastical story that made you think, well, I didn't even think at the time. I was just so blown away. I was like, oh my God, that's huge. And it all matched up with the things that he told me in the past when he was in New York, where he worked on Wall Street, all of the detail that had come in many, many conversations previously, that when he told me that, it all matched. And so again, and the level of detail was so big that I just couldn't, there was nothing inside me that disbelieved him.
But even he'd bring it back up throughout your relationship. I can't face I've got to face the wall, or I can't face the wall, and stuff like that. So it just kept coming. It was very clever.
Yes, and everything matched. So the conversations and the information that came over time, it was like death by 1,000 cuts. There was not one misstep in that information or in that story. And I'd remember back and I think, he said that last time. And it all matched. And it was just another layer to the story, another piece of information. But when it comes to you in those little bits and pieces, it's not as fantastical as it sounds when it's in one go. And that's what kind of coercive control and grooming looks like in terms of, I'll just give you a little snippet of information that will put a story together in your mind. And by the time it gets to the end, it's a big, weird, crazy story that seems so outrageous. But little bit at a time, it's not.
The other thing about the stories is that, you realise now that they were told in a way to kind of gain two things, sympathy and trust.
Yeah.
So they were often quite sad or kind of uniquely making you feel bad for him.
Yeah, he weaponized empathy 100%. And quite often people like him will choose someone like me who is a compassionate, empathetic person, because when someone tells you that story, of course your heart goes out to them. And he also knew, in those early days that my father had passed away young. So I think there was a part of him that was telling me that story, because not everyone got the plane crash story.
Right.
There were different stories for different people. So I got the parents died in the plane crash. Now, I think there was a part of him that knew that if he told me that, he would gain an extra level of empathy from me because I had lost my father. So I know what it's like to lose a parent, and I had my heart went out to him. And, and then I'm thinking he was 6 years old. Imagine growing up without without your parents and things like that. So he weaponized empathy to gain your trust and gain your sympathy and kind of put you on his side, I guess. And that's how he built his relationships with everybody. It's just they were different stories for different people, depending on what button he needed to push for each individual.
Can you explain how he weaved into all of this, how much money he had? And I say that with quotation marks. How rich he was.
I think it was sentence at a time, experience at a time. It was many, 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 many conversations over a long period of time about his job. So he told me he was a chief financial officer at a family office. And I knew what a family office was. They, manage money on behalf of wealthy families. It is a thing. And, why wouldn't he be doing that? And so there were a lot of conversations. I would overhear multiple conversations of him talking to people in his back office about the price of stocks, the price of gold. What was that yesterday? What's it going to close at today? We've got to do this by X amount of time. We need to close out that deal. What's happening with, Trump's press conference and what impact's that going to have on the markets? What about this happening in Tokyo? What about, it went on and on and on. And I heard people on the other end of his, conversations. So there were people I don't know, working with him, or there was something going on. I don't know who these people were. And so it sort of built a picture over time. And, he had, over that sort of first year that I was with him, he had 5 cars.
Good cars too.
Great cars. And, there was a story around each of them. And I'm thinking to myself, what a jerk. Like, what 40-year-old guy who lives in Bondi needs 5 cars? He doesn't even have any kids. Like,
Where do you park 5 cars in Bondi?
Well, it was like Tetris. Like, he had all these car parks that he hired. I saw 4 of the cars, and I saw a photo in his garage of the 5th car. Now, I don't know. I don't think this was his car, but I don't know how he got that car in the garage to take a photo. Anyway, so there was those signs of wealth. There was a lot of conversation. He didn't live an extravagant lifestyle. He ate out a lot. He was very generous. He had the 5 cars. He wore nice clothes, things like that. But it wasn't like he was living in a mansion at Vaucluse or anything like that.
But he did, as you kind of detail in the book, he'd kind of point out houses.
Oh, yeah.
Woolloomooloo, for those that don't know Sydney, there's a finger wharf there and there's some apartments that I don't even want to think what they would be worth.
Yeah.
And he would just casually say to you, I lived there once.
Yeah, and he did. And this is only in retrospect I've been able to join all these dots. It was kind of like one truth and 2 lies. So there was always something that was true. So he did have an apartment there when he was married. Didn't know he was married. But anyway, he told me he was engaged to this woman called Beck, and she had 3 sons. Her name was Beck, and she did have 3 sons, but he wasn't engaged. He was actually married to her. And, she was an alcoholic. She wasn't an alcoholic. So there was this kind of spider's web of some truths and some lies. And in the years following his arrest, I've had to really untangle that and work out what was true and what was not. He had a house at Kilco. We drove past it one day. Oh, yeah, I used to own that one. He did. And the cars ended up disappearing because after I made that kind of joking, serious comment to him about being a jerk for having 5 cars, the cars started disappearing. And he came back to me and said, I said, what happened to the Porsche? And he goes, you know what, T, I've been thinking about what you've been saying, and you're right. I don't need all these cars. It's ridiculous. I'm trying to simplify my life. We've spoken about this. And then suddenly the cars started disappearing.
So do you think that was him moulding himself for you?
Yeah. He was a complete shapeshifter. So one of his tactics, in addition to weaponizing empathy, is that mirroring. And this is what people that con do. They reflect you back to yourself, knowing that if someone is, it's like a similarity bias. So we are more likely to love and like and fall in love with someone who looks like us, sounds like us, has similar values to us, likes doing the same things as us. And all he had to do was listen to what I wanted for my life and what my morals and my values were, reflect those back to me in the form of Max to Vita. And he knew I'd fall in love with him, which is exactly what happened. So, yeah, he shapeshifted because for other people, he was a different character. He was a barrister for someone. He was a businessman for another. He was a triathlete for another. For me, he was this character who reflected my values and morals. So as soon as I said you're a jerk for having 5 cars, the cars started disappearing. I am pretty certain that if I had said, I want designer clothes and I want fancy dinners and I want all the things, then that would have somehow materialised.
Can we talk about sex for a moment? Because he gained the nickname the slow burn.
Yes.
In your circle of friends. How did sex or lack of sex kind of manifest in the way he kind of wooed you?
He just wasn't interested. He was not interested really very much in physical intimacy. There would be hand-holding and things like that, but yeah, it was a massive fizzle. It was a massive fizzle. And in speaking to other people that know him or have known him and were in intimate relationships with him, specifically his ex-wife, the conversations are all the same. So there's obviously some issue there. I don't really know what it is, but yeah, it was pretty much non-existent. And it did bother me, because I thought it was weird. It's just weird.
Yeah.
And I actually ended up talking to my therapist about it, and she essentially convinced me that it wasn't that unusual, and that if everything else was falling into line, then, it's okay for things to be, slow. And if that's not really high on your list of, what you want out of a relationship, then, focus on the other things. And of course, he over-indexed on emotional intimacy and conversation and listening and care and support and just being there. He over-indexed on all of that. And then I thought, well, if I've got that and not that, well,
I think it shows how good he was at that you were willing to be like, yep, all right, I'll forgo that, because he was so good at that emotional intimacy.
Yeah. And I thought to myself, well, if I can have one or the other, which do I choose? What do I choose? Well, of course I'm going to choose the support and the emotional intimacy and, the fact that I felt completely supported and we were a team and we were building a life together. And I thought, you know what? We're not 20 anymore. Sometimes this is what happens. That's okay. I guess I accepted it.
As you fell in love, and because you were with this man for 18 months, he met your daughter, you met his brother-in-law.
Yeah.
It got serious.
Yeah,
like,
he
you were
met all
in
my
each other's
family.
lives.
Yeah. He met a lot of people in my world that weren't attached to Sydney, because I don't come from, I've lived here, 25 years, but my family are all up north and friends and things like that. So when we went up north to Byron and places like that, he was very, very open to meeting my family, my friends up there, anybody that wasn't attached to Sydney. But he was super weird about spending time with my friends in Sydney. He really resisted it. He really resisted me meeting his sister and his nieces. He was estranged from one sister, so that was never on the cards. His parents were, of course, dead. So I never questioned that. But I did meet his brother-in-law, yeah.
The brother-in-law, it was his actual brother-in-law, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So, but that part of the con fascinates me, because he was kind of walking on eggshells there, because you could very well have found out that his name was Hamish, but somehow you didn't, because he was kind of playing you off him.
Well, it was weird, because I looked back and I thought, how come, why didn't Chris say something? And what I realised was, in the interactions that we had, and the same with Anna and a few other people, I never actually used his name. I never actually said, hey, Max. I never said, oh, Max told me this about you. Because what I realised is, in conversation, we actually don't use people's names very often. So we might say, oh, you just carry on this conversation. You just assume everyone is on the same piece of information, And so I came to realise very quickly that his name was never used. But he must have been shitting himself. He must have been. And there was one particular time where we were at his apartment in Bondi, and he had the childhood friend that he grew up with, that family. One of the boys was over, and we're talking away and we're reading the newspapers and what have you. And he called him, the friend called him Hambone in the conversation. And I kind of clocked it and I thought, oh, that's weird. And then he left, and I said, why did he call you Hambone? And as quick as a flash, he goes, oh, because when I was young and we were growing up together, I was really, really skinny, and everyone said I needed to put ham on my bones and meat on my legs. So they called me Hambone. He did not even draw breath. It was like he was waiting for that to come up, and he just had an answer, like he did with everything I questioned. And, so when that happens and you don't sort of, that intuitive feeling of when someone's like, it's because it was just straight off the bat, down the barrel, said what it was. And I was like, oh, that makes sense. But of course, Hambone is Hamish, H-A-M. Yeah. So these are the things that I know now. But of course, at the time, it's just, he must have been crapping his stacks.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Gemma Barth. I'm speaking with Tracy Hall, the last victim of conman Hamish McLaren. Up next, Tracy tells me about the first time Hamish was able to convince her to send him a large sum of money. When was the first time he brought up money, or the idea of you parting with some money to invest in something of his?
It was towards the end of that first year. It was around the time of the US election. And he came to me one day and said, I'm privy to some information. And I think that there's going to be something that happens with a very wealthy family in the US that is going to mean the markets are going to be favourable. You know, he had this big spiel. There was a lot of monologues that went on. And so he's telling me this story and he said, Jules and Chris, which was his sister and brother-in-law, Jules and Chris are investing separately to what I'm doing for the family office clients. And, you know, obviously I've been talking to Jules about you, and it was Jules that suggested that maybe I should talk to you about it because, you know, I want you to be financially independent. I can see how hard you're working. And he said, normally I don't mix business with pleasure, but this is an opportunity. And Jules put the idea in my head, and I just thought I'd run it past you and see what you think. So that was the start of the conversation. And I asked a bunch of questions, and he was very vague with the information because he was like, look, there are things that I can tell you and there are things that I can't tell you. And again, everything was very quick and professional, and he knew the answers. And I ended up saying to him, because I've worked in finance in my career, and I ended up saying to him, but isn't this insider trading? Like, if you're privy to some information that is going to adjust the markets favourably, you shouldn't be having that conversation and getting personal benefit out of that. And again, quick as a flash, he goes, you know what? I thought that too. So I went to my barrister, I went to my lawyer, and I've had a lengthy conversation with him yesterday about it. I spoke about Jules, I spoke about you. I'm not investing personally, but you know, and he just had these
answers.
And it wasn't just, oh no, it's fine, and that's it. It was a lengthy, detailed answer that had me believe that it was all legit. So that's where that started, and I ended up investing in that scheme to start with.
You invested $10K to start with, and then you kind of let it sit, and then he came back to you to kind of give you updates on it.
Yeah, I mean, as soon as the time had passed, which he said was the date that passed, he said, I've got good news. You doubled your money. And I was like, wow, okay. And he said, do you want me to transfer that back into your account? And I remember being in the car driving, and I thought to myself, I can't deal with that now. I said, no, just leave it for now. We'll figure that out later. I was busy. I was distracted. And that was sort of where that conversation ended. And then after that, the other conversation started. So it sort of merged into that after a while.
The other conversation was about your super fund, and that kind of started a few months later.
Yeah.
He was very clever in the way he posed that.
Yeah. Never once did he ask me how much I earned, how much I had in savings, anything like that, how much I had in my super. He said to me, do you know what you're paying in fees on your superannuation account? And I said, I've got no idea. And he goes, you should look into that because they're thieves. They're absolute thieves. The money that I make for my family office clients is extraordinary compared to what those super funds are doing. And that was the first conversation. And then it just went from there. And again, every couple of weeks it might come up, or every now and again in a conversation. And he was always very critical of the super funds, the fees that they took and how they were managing the money of Australians. So, you know, he was quite controversial in his views. He was a contrarian, and he made no bones about it. So he had no problem, you know, having a different point of view to general population. But he'd tap that in every now and again, and then over time you just start to think about it.
So his idea was for you to self-manage your superannuation and for him to be in charge of it.
Yeah, so eventually he said, I think you'd be better off having a self-managed super fund because it could be invested in a way that would make you far greater returns. You would be paying less fees, and you would be in control of where you invest that. So again, those conversations came a lot and over time. And he essentially groomed me through that process. So he went and worked with a solicitor to get all of the documentation that was required to create a self-managed super fund in my name, which is what we did. It was completely legitimate. I had all of the setup correct and went to my super fund and asked them to transfer it out to my self-managed super fund. To do that, like, that's not easy to do. You have to have a whole bunch of things for them to do that. So that was all in place. I set up a business account with Westpac, and that's where the money went. And then the second part of that, and it was all in my name, and then the second part of that was, he said, we're going to set you up a trading account with Bell Potter Securities. Bell Potter Securities is a trading firm. It's very legitimate. I filled in the documentation. I had my ID signed by a JP. I was opening up a Bell Potter Securities investment account in my self-managed super fund name. And that's where it was going to be invested and tracked and everything. So I gave all of that information to him. But the mistake I made is that I didn't submit those forms. He submitted those forms on behalf of me. And what I think happened is that those forms were actually never submitted.
Right.
And what I know now is, because I've gone through a financial advisor and done everything properly, is that I should have had the logins. The email should have come to me. He should have been have access to it like a financial advisor does. But everything should have come to me first with the logins and everything. I never got those. So that's how I know that there was never a fund, an investment fund set up at Bell Potter. The check that I took out from Westpac, which was my superannuation, 22-year career superannuation, $187,000, I made out a check to Bell Potter Securities, which is what he told me to do. And I gave that check to him thinking he was investing it into my account. And because it was just to Bell Potter Securities, it didn't have my name on it, that check went into one of his accounts at Bell Potter Securities, and that's how he washed the money.
It's not like you didn't ask for the logins.
I asked a lot, yeah. I've still got those text messages. It's funny looking at them, actually.
Well, they were very clever, and there was one example that I've written here where you were in a process of trying to finalise your divorce, and you were like, do you have that statement on my super for my legal stuff? And he wrote, yep, yes, can print anytime.
Yeah.
So he was always very... Yeah, sure.
Of course. Of course. I'll do it when I get home, or I'm just in a meeting now. It was always future promise. And future promise could have been 2 hours from now. And then, of course, again, because I was busy, I was stretched, I was distracted. It just, and then I'd ask again and there'd be another excuse. And, these things just sort of went on and on. But, yeah, there was a lot of delay, but never a no. Never a no. And eventually he gave me a statement that was on Bell Potter letterhead. And it was about 6 pages, I think, from memory. And it had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of lines of trades. And I'm looking at it and I'm thinking, I've never seen a statement like this before. I'd never done anything like that before. I really wasn't, in a position to do that. And I'm looking at it and I said, well, what does all of this mean? And he said the individual trades, of which there are hundreds, they won't make any sense. That's how we, work the markets and, what have you. But what you need to know is the amount up the top was the amount that went in, and the amount at the end of the report is the value that you've now got in your investment account. Tracy Hall Investments, Bell Potter Securities account, all the details. It was all on what was fake letterhead, but all on official documentation. So I read that and I was like, oh, okay, well then that's looking good. And it all looked very legitimate. So I sort of believed that. And then that was what sort of the information I needed to then, as time went on, sell some tech shares that I had been, that had vested while I was working at eBay, and sell those and invest those as well.
So you made a few more significant transactions in, an 80K here and a 40K here.
Yeah.
Because he was telling you that it was working. You were earning money on your super like you hadn't seen.
That's right. And also too, because of all the other conversations that were happening about the markets and the political impact on the markets globally and who's doing what and which stocks are going up and which are going down, he was very vocal about US tech, which were the shares that I had through my employment. And he said, T, you should sell those because they're at an all-time high. And I'd look at them and I go, they actually are at an all-time high because I know how to look at a stock report. And he said, this is going to happen and Trump's doing these things and, so-and-so's doing these and these are some extra taxes they're putting on this industry in Australia. Like everything he had all this information. But of course, remember, he didn't have a job. So he had days and hours to research this stuff to all sort of back up what he said. So if I did look at it, it would match. And it did. So, of course, I trusted him. I believed him. I thought he had my best interests at heart. And so I sold those stock and I put it into the self-managed super fund. I was very happy to hand over my financial security to him because I thought he was a professional. I thought he had my best interests at heart and I thought we were building a future together. But in retrospect, I should have given him the after-school pickup. I should have given him the laundry. I should have given him the groceries. I should not have given him my money. I didn't protect it enough because, again, I just felt seen. And, I thought we were building a future together. So that was probably the mistake I made.
You say it was a mistake, but you've kind of detailed how clever he was.
Yeah.
And the flashiness of the money, I feel like, is a big part of it because you kind of mentioned that he would have these sugar daddy moments where he'd say, oh, you've been working so hard, Tracy, let me buy you a first-class plane ticket across the world. Like someone who is conning you, you don't think that they're going to do stuff like that.
No, and that was another moment where I just laughed at him because I was like, in what world can I take a trip anywhere right now, regardless of whether it's first class or not? Like, do you understand anything about my life? And I said, I don't want that from you. It felt icky, and I think he was just testing me to see what he needed to give me to lure me in. And that isn't something that impresses me. So I was sort of like, that just feels icky. And then sort of, over a year down the track, I'd had a particularly hard day at work. You might remember this from the book. And, I was bitching and moaning about work and I was tired. And I was sort of expressing that to him. And he said, Trace, you work harder than anyone I know. I don't know anyone that works harder than you. I can see you moving your career in another direction. You're in your early 40s now, does the big spiel, builds you up, biggest cheerleader in the world. And he says, why don't you quit your job? I will put $1 million in your bank account tomorrow and you can really have a good break from work and work out what you want to do next because you are talented, you are amazing, you are a hard worker and I want you to have that life for yourself. And I'm thinking, for a hot minute, Gemma.
$1 million would be nice.
Maybe more than a hot minute. I was thinking, wow, wouldn't that be amazing? I was tired. I was burnt out. And, but again, it felt icky. And I said to him, you know what, I'm just having a bad day. And in retrospect, had I have accepted that offer, he would have taken away my only financial lifeline that helped me get out of the hole that I was in when he got arrested. Because when he got arrested, I'd lost everything, but I still had my job. So I still had my monthly income, right? And it's not lost on me that I'm very fortunate and I was very privileged to have that job. It was a good job. I had a very supportive employer. I was being paid well. And that is the only way I got myself out of my financial hole. But he was about to take that away not long before he got arrested. And again, financial coercive control, right? Because I would have been completely reliant on him. And also too, in my head, I'm going, in what world am I going to get $1 million to pay you back? Like, what? And I just said, look, I'm having a really bad day. It's going to be fine. I just need a good sleep. And thank the Lord, I didn't leave my job or forgo my income, because had I done that and he got arrested soon after, I actually don't know where I'd be right now.
Next, Tracy tells us about the moment it clicked for her that the man she knew as Max wasn't who he said he was. I want to talk about your friends.
Yeah.
Because they were suspicious.
Yeah.
From the kind of the start.
There were some more than others, and I think people definitely had a point of view, but I guess when your friend has been through a divorce and has met someone new and seems really happy, you want to be happy for your friends. They didn't know him. They hadn't spent time with him. They may have come across him very briefly, and, I guess from the outside he was quirky. He did want to just be him and I, but to me that made sense because we didn't get a lot of time together because of my schedule with my daughter. So, when we did get time and I'd say, hey, let's go for dinner with these friends, he'd say, oh, but I haven't seen you for 2 weeks, babe. Like, can it just be us? And, again, music to your ears because I'm like, oh, he just wants to get to know me. And in those early stages of relationship, I guess that's what you do. But yes, there were friends that were definitely suspicious, had their spidey senses up. But there was only one friend really that I had told what I was doing with him, and she is an incredibly curious person, Kath, and she would ask questions, and she still does to this day until she gets to the bottom. It's never surface with her. And she'd found out that he was encouraging me to do my super and set up the self-managed super. And anyway, I had sort of divulged a bit of this information to her. And she took me for breakfast one morning and she was crying across the table. And this is the most stoic woman. Like I've known her for like 18 years. I've never seen her cry before. And she's holding my hand and she's got tears running down her face. And I'm thinking something's happened to one of her kids. Like what could possibly be wrong? And she said, I'm really worried about you investing your money with Max. And I was like, what are you talking about? She said, Trace, I don't think he's who he says he is. And I was like, and I was so confused at the time because in my head I'm thinking, but you've never even met him, but of course she had heard things and, unbeknownst to me, she was doing her background due diligence on him and, running number plates on the car and writing off to universities in America that he said he went to, paying money to get.
Go Kath.
Yeah, she needs an investigative journalist job 100%. And, I didn't know any of this at the time. And I said, Kath, he's the most solid person I've ever met. You'll see when you meet him. He's amazing. And I'm happier than I've ever been. He's got my back and, we're building a future together. And I 100% believed that. And she could see everything and I just couldn't see it. And I think it's important to say too, I had my rose-coloured glasses on. And when you're wearing your rose-coloured glasses, all the red flags are just flags. So, I didn't heed that warning. And I also didn't talk about what I was doing. And that's one of my pieces of advice for people with money. Money's really hard to talk about.
It is.
It's icky. It's like it's one of the last taboos.
Yeah.
And I don't really understand why. And I believe that had I have spoken to 5 Kaths or 5 of my besties about what I was doing, most of them would have come back and said the same thing. And maybe if 4 out of those 5 had had that conversation with me, a very difficult conversation because she didn't want to be right. She didn't want him to be who he was. She didn't know who he was. She just knew it was off. And she didn't want to be right. She wanted me to be happy. And so it's a hard conversation for her to have. She thought we'd lose our friendship. And so difficult but necessary, and had a bunch of my friends had that conversation with me, then perhaps I wouldn't be where I am now.
Well, it ended up being Kath who kind of broke the news to you that he'd been arrested. Take me back to July 2017 because by that point, 18 months, you love this man, you trust him wholeheartedly.
Yeah, we're building a future together. Yeah, so essentially I had not heard from him in over 24 hours, which was very, very unusual. This is a man I spoke to like 10 times a day. And I missed a call from him and I spent the rest of the day trying to get back in touch. By that night, I was getting pretty worried because I thought, this is odd. And I had a very sleepless night. By 5 o'clock the next morning, I was absolutely frantic. And I was so frantic that I called Bondi Police and I asked them to do a wellness check on him because I thought maybe there's been a surfing accident. Maybe something's happened. I just knew it wasn't right. And so I gave them all of his personal details and they were off doing that. And Kath called me and she said, how are you? And I said, I haven't slept a wink. Something's happened to Max and I don't know, I'm really worried. And she said, I'm going to send you a link to a news article and you're going to look at it and then you're going to call me straight back. And she sent me the link to the Crime Stoppers video of him being arrested. And, I was just in disbelief. I had kids around me running around off to school holiday camps and I'm trying to sort of digest this piece of information. And of course, I knew it was him. His face was all blurred out, but he's very distinct. And I'm like, there's a mistake. There's a mistake. And I called her back and I said, but I think they've got it wrong, Kath. They've got it wrong. And she said, I don't think they've got it wrong, Trace. And with that, then I was trying to get in touch with his family, so with Chris, with Anna, with people that knew him. Because I'd been on the internet all night looking for these people, trying to contact them to say, have you heard from him? And it was, it was sort of just this video and a headline about what he had been arrested for. And I'm trying to contact his brother-in-law, Chris, and Chris eventually called me back, or he said, call me back urgently. And in brackets, he wrote Chris, Hamish's brother-in-law. And that's the first time I saw his name. And I called him and he picked up and I said, Chris, who the fuck is Hamish? Because this whole time I'm going, it's Max, it's Max, it's Max. And
because there was no name on the Crime Stoppers, because it would have been a police release.
Said Bondi businessman. It said Bondi businessman 47, superannuation fraud. And in my head, this is how screwed up my brain was at the time. I'm like, they've got it wrong because Max is only 42. Because of course his age was wrong, his name was wrong, everything was wrong. And I called back Bondi Police and I said, I just want to let you know that you don't need to do the wellness check. He's been arrested. They said, yeah, we know. But the name of the person, the age of the person, all the details surrounding that person that you said lives at that address is actually not the person who lives at that address. And I just kind of went, but yeah, it is, because I've just spent a year and a half of my life with this man.
Yeah.
I was convinced that it was. And they said, it's not. And I said, well, who is it? What are we talking about? And they said, you'll need to call the detectives working on the case that have arrested him. We can't give you any more information. And that's when everything sort of started to fall apart after that.
Once you had the name, his real name,
yeah,
it didn't take very long to kind of get a bit of an idea because he'd already been charged at that point. With certain things.
Yes, there was a very long list of things that he had done in the past that he had been in court for, or there had been charges laid. He had lost a financial advisor. I think he had a futures license. He had lost that, so there was a ban on him on the ASIC register. So there was once I knew his name, there is a very, very lengthy, rabbit hole that you can go down and learn all about his crimes over the past 30 years, internationally.
Blogs with people.
Yep.
It was big by then, even before all of the stuff
even
that
before
followed.
This. Yeah. There was a lot of people that were very unhappy with things that he had done. Lisa Ho had been through a trial with him.
Already at that point. And
yes.
She is an Australian designer, for those that don't know her.
Yeah, she was one of the victims. But she had taken him to court previously about money that he had stolen from her. And that, I believe, was sort of some sort of a superannuation thing as well. So she had gone privately to try and, claw back that money. And that was about 6 or 7 months before he was arrested, that case went through. And there was stuff online about that, but of course it was under the name of Hamish McLaren, so I never saw any of that because I was Googling Max Tavita. So, yeah, there's a very lengthy, and what's come out from the podcast, Who the Hell is Hamish, is that whilst the Australian police were charging him for swindling $7.6 million from 15 victims, it's more likely to be $80 to $100 million globally. Yeah, there is almost not one corner of the globe that he hasn't stolen money from people.
That day that you found that out, can you even take yourself back to how you felt?
I mean, at the beginning, shock, disbelief, denial, which I think is very natural because I was so confused.
And to have it all change within such an instant,
Yeah. It was, I think that was the hardest thing because it took me nearly 18 months to fall in love with this man. And keep in mind, I'd been through a divorce and, divorce is not generally a happy thing for anybody, right? You don't come out of that intact all the time. So I'd been through that. It had been a slowly, we built the relationship slowly and I fell in love with him, but it took me 18 months to fall in love with him. And literally within 24 hours, I had to come to terms with the fact that I didn't love this man, but in fact, this man never actually existed. He was a fake person. But then there was a part of me that really missed him. And then in the months, and I'm going to say years after, it was, a process of putting myself back together. In the beginning, there was a lot of stuff I had to do really urgently, like really practical things, like dealing with the ATO on a non-compliant, potentially like a fraudulent tax return. There was my non-compliant superannuation fund that had $0 in it. There was the police statement, preparing the police statement. I think my police statement was 30-something pages long. I had to recount 18 months of my life, pull out text messages and emails and conversations, remember where we went. Like I had to remember everything. I had a 6-year-old at home and I was on my own. I was a single mom and, I made a decision very early on that there'd be no tears at the dinner table. Because who was going to get her where she needed to go? Who was going to make her lunch? Who was going to get her to her school and activities? If I was in the fetal position all day, I didn't have anyone.
Yeah.
So pressed on in that regard. I had to get back to work because it was my only financial lifeline and it was a big job. But I doubled down. I worked harder than I've ever worked. It was great distraction, in retrospect. And then I had to get really smart really quickly about my money because I had nothing except my monthly income.
Did the police give you any sign at the start? Because obviously there's all the emotional stuff, this man you loved, but I'm imagining that you then started going, my money, because you've invested, over $300,000 with this man.
Yeah.
Did they give you any sign that you might get that back?
They were pretty honest from the beginning, but they were very compassionate and empathetic as well. It wasn't a kind of like, you'll never see your money again.
Right.
But I think they knew deep down that money was gone. They had been looking and forensically looking at his accounts for months. 6 months they were looking at him.
Why hadn't they contacted you earlier?
Well, I think they what they were doing were trying to build a body of evidence from people that so one person had made a complaint and then they needed another couple of victims to come forward, give information. It's actually very, very difficult to prosecute fraud.
Really?
Really hard. Because on paper, it looks like I have freely given him my money, which I did.
Yeah.
But it was done under deceit. It was used for nefarious reasons. It was a crime. But to prove that it's a crime, there's a lot that goes into that. And so to get him arrested and bail refused is what they say. So they didn't want to arrest him on a very light case and then have him say, oh, look, it's nothing, give the bail, because he was a flight risk at that point. So they had to gather enough information with people that they knew would give them the information they needed to do that. I was not one of those people because, to be honest, I would have probably told him. If they had have come to me and said, Tracy, this is what we're doing, this is what we're dealing with, I was in such a deep relationship with him. I think it was too much of a risk for them to do that.
You were too close.
I think so. And I don't know that they were really that interested in looking at me at that point because they had these other victims that were giving them all the information they needed to know that they had enough charges against him when he was arrested that he would be bail refused, which is exactly what happened. And then I contacted Tom Zadravec, who was the head detective, and he said, you need to come down to the police station straight away. And, of course, you know, I got his real name, I got all the details, but everything was very vague. It was like there are a lot of victims. There is millions of dollars. And I think I had a friend with me that day and she said, is it likely that Tracy will get her money back? And they said, probably unlikely. But it was never a hard no. And I guess you always hold out hope that through that court process there's going to be some kind of recovery of funds. But in this case, and what I've learnt about this type of crime is that the detectives and the DPP and the police and everyone working on the case, their job is to put him in jail for the longest period of time possible. And that's what they did. He got an incredibly long sentence based on precedent, right? Their job is not to go find our money. They don't have the resources. They don't have the technology. They don't have the time. They are so stretched. And so, you know, whilst that feels unfair, it's like, what would you rather?
Is it anyone's job to go and find your money? Or is it just yours?
It's mine because it's my money that I lost. And, you know, as a group of victims, we could potentially pay somebody to do it. But when you've lost your life savings and you're trying to rebuild your life, you don't have money to pay a private investigator.
No.
And you couldn't be throwing good money after bad. You don't know, right? And offshore money is very hard to trace. If it's been converted to crypto, it's very hard to trace. It is a long bow. And it's, you know, at that point in time, I didn't have the resources. I didn't have the mental capacity. I didn't have the mental health. I was doing everything, Gemma, just to get out of bed every day. And, you know, so I was dealing with all these very practical things, but underneath I was dying. I was in the biggest depressed, anxious shame hole of my life. And that was not a great place to be.
And he was still contacting you?
Yes.
From prison?
Yes.
Tell me about that, because he wrote you letters.
Yeah.
Very weird letters.
Yeah. I mean, again, trying to gain empathy. So lots of musings about how hard things were for him and how much he just wanted a picture of us just to remind him of all the good times. And then he'd list out all the good times and how we were building our life together and this chapter is just a bump in the road. And
what does he mean?
Yeah. I mean, I think the guy was on shrooms at the time.
What do you mean, sir?
Yeah, it was quite, you know, but I guess you have to understand too, from my point of view, I was clutching at straws. I was trying to get any information I could. And so the police couldn't talk to me because it was a legal case. The authorities and the banks and Bell Potter and everything, they couldn't talk to me because it was a legal case. His friends and family wouldn't talk to me. And, you know, I got no information. So I was just desperate. I was clutching at straws and he was really keen for me to go and see him in those early days, months afterwards. And I just got to the point where I thought, you know what good could come of me going to see him? This is a man who has not told me the truth for the last 18 months of my life. And he has taken all of my money. He's lied about everything. In what universe is he suddenly going to look me in the eye and tell me the truth? So I couldn't trust anything he said. And there was part of me that felt like he was just sort of trying to lure me back in some regard. And these letters, like reading them now, they're just like they're in the book. They're just laughable in a way. But yeah, I stopped hearing from him when I was sent a bunch of flowers from him to my work. One day, a huge bunch of natives. And the card in capital letters said, "See you soon.
Oh, that's
Love,
so
Hamish." And I threw up. I literally threw up in the office bathrooms because I just felt sick. I thought he was downstairs waiting for me.
You thought he'd gotten bail or he was out or?
How does a criminal send flowers from jail?
Yeah.
Like
that says, "I'll see you soon," kind of.
Yeah. And it all went along with the letters that were like, "Come see me, come see me." And it was at that point that I then contacted the detectives, and because I was a mess. This was like 6 months after he was arrested. And anyway, it stopped very soon after that.
I know that you kind of did get the chance to kind of pepper him with lots of questions.
Yeah.
Like, was any of it true? Did you work with NASA?
Yeah.
Did you go to Mensa? Was he able to did he give you any, this was truth, this wasn't truth, or he just
No, he was very dismissive of the anxiety I had around all those questions, because it was very much a peppering of, what is your name? Are your parents alive? What is true? What is not? Where did you go to school? Who are your friends? What about this? Like, I had so many questions. And he just responded. I remember him responding with, don't get hung up on a name, T. It's just a name. It's just a name. You know who I am. And I'm like, I actually don't know who you are. I have no idea who you are. What are you even talking about? Is it Max? Is it Hamish? Is it McLaren? Is it Watson? Like, what is your name? Who are you? He's like, it's just a name.
You mentioned that Hamish got kind of the maximum sentence. It was, to start with, 16 years with a non-parole period of 12 years. As the maximum, I imagine you would have been pretty happy with that.
Yeah, I was in shock. That was the next moment I was really in shock, because the judge read out the sentence, and it was a really lengthy court day. It was over a 2-week period, and it went on for hours, and he had taken the time to really go through every victim and lay out the true impact, because we weren't sort of able to do victim impact statements or anything like that. So he was sort of advocating, I felt, on behalf of the victims, who were all mostly in the courthouse at that time. And he read it out. And I think in my mind, when I went in that day, I thought, if he gets 5, that's a good outcome. 5 or 7. That was the number I had in my head. I don't even know what I based that on. I think the police had spoken to us. There had been a little bit of conversation from the DPP, and I think they were sort of guiding us towards a number to have in your head so that you weren't disappointed. And then he read out 16 years, and I just kind of had this, it was almost like I blacked out. It was just like this tunnel, black tunnel happened around me, and it just went down to this point. And I remember everyone's like clapping in the gallery, and I'm just there going, holy shit. Like, it was huge. And I'm thinking, okay, and I'm doing the sums, like, what year will that be? How old will I be? How old will he be? Where will I be in my life? Like, I was just tunneled into that. And then I came out and I was just like shaking, and I was in shock. And, that was a good day. That was a good day. But it was the end of a 3-year process that was very, very exhausting. So I also felt quite tired.
I can imagine.
In that moment. But then he appealed, of course, and the sentence was reduced by 4 years. So he received 12 years in the end, 9 non-parole. And his 9 years non-parole comes up next July.
I don't want to say signs or how do we avoid this, but for romance-specific scams, what is your advice to people to try and avoid something like this? It feels very hard to try and avoid, but how do we keep our wits about us?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I would say trust but verify.
Right.
So don't go into the world being all cynical. Be skeptical, don't be cynical, but trust and verify. So there are things that I dismissed that I should have looked more boldly at and been more curious about. The fact he didn't have a digital footprint. Weird.
Didn't even have a LinkedIn.
Nah. But it of course, had a reason for that.
Yeah.
And because I asked him about it, but it had a very quick response. But, yeah, odd. Massive red flag. If you are in this day and age without a digital footprint anywhere on the internet, there's nothing written about you, like, that's weird. I would say meet family and friends very quickly. You need other people to verify this person, especially if you meet as complete strangers on a dating app, which most of us do now, right?
Yeah.
I would say that things like there's reverse image searches and things that you can do. Now, had I have done a reverse image search on Max Tavita, I would have found Hamish McLaren.
That's a very sneaky one, though. You don't think to, like, reverse image search your dates.
Ladies, I think you should. I don't think there's anything wrong with that.
Yeah.
You are essentially going on a date or going to somebody's house that you don't know anything about. You may not have met any of their friends and family. You may not know anything about their history. They could be anybody. So I think it's a safety issue as well. Yes, it feels weird because you want to go into it with an open heart and an open mind into any type of relationship, especially if you have a spark and a connection. But I think it's just it's just one of those things we have to do now, unfortunately. So they are the things that I would say be really, really careful of. I think what happens when we get scammed, and this is the rose-coloured glasses thing, is, and what scammers try and do is they essentially try to put you into a heightened emotional state. Because in a heightened emotional state, we actually have less access to our logical thinking. And those heightened emotional states, one of them is love. Because when you're in love, you don't see the things. You know, when you first meet someone and you're in love and everything's great, and then after 3 years you're like, I hate the way he breathes.
Well, they call it the honeymoon period for a reason.
That's right. And, you know, you don't see the things because your brain has essentially been hijacked by your emotions. Now, the other emotions that the scammers and fraudsters use are fear. If you don't do this, this will happen. Excitement. I've got this incredible investment opportunity and you're going to be financially independent if you do this, or hope. So they are essentially the biggest kind of emotional states that if you recognize them within yourself, you can actually start to think, okay, well, my brain's probably not thinking as critically as it would otherwise, like a friend on the side. So they're the things I say too, is be aware of your emotional state, because it'll actually hijack your critical thinking. And this is where talking to friends or having friends involved is really great too, because their brains haven't been hijacked because they think he breathes funny and he looks weird.
Get yourself a cath.
Everyone
needs a cath.
Everyone needs a cath. We love cath.
Tracy, are you happy now? What does your life look like now?
My life is great. We're sort of nearly 7 years, or we're nearly 8 years down the track from his arrest. It has been, I hate this word, but a journey. You know, a lot has happened.
Yeah.
There were a couple of really, really hard years. And a lot of just, I don't know how I'm going to get out of bed today years. But over time and with the right support and the right mindset and, you know, having things like my daughter and my job and, you know, incredible friends, and that's helped me through. And, you know, a truckload of therapy, all different types of therapy, to help me really understand how something like this could happen to someone like me, because I never thought it would be me. I never thought this would happen to me. And then, of course, writing the book was very cathartic. So it's been a journey of just sort of like unraveling the impact it's had on me to a point now where I have a fire in my belly to ensure that this does not happen to one single more person ever. And I know that's a naive thought, but I will do whatever I can to do it. So I speak to corporates full-time about this. I work with corporations to enhance their communications, to make sure that what they're pushing out is effective and impactful. And so that's what I'm spending my time and energy on now. And that has given me so much purpose in life. And yeah, I am happy. I mean, he's been in jail for nearly 8 years. I get to see the ocean every day. Like, who is winning? Yeah. I'm winning. So, you know, I think about things like that. I think about how grateful I am and the life that I have. And certainly my future is probably going to pan out a little differently to what it was previously, but that's okay as well.
And you found love again, haven't you?
I have found love again, yes.
So you can trust again eventually.
Well, yes. The person I've known for a very long time, we worked together in the early 2000s at a hedge fund. And so I've known him for a very, very long time. So that's probably why I can trust him. I'm not sure if it wasn't him, I might be a cat lady.
I think what I take away from your book and your experience is that this really can happen to anyone.
Yeah, it can. I think it's safe to say we are all far more financially and digitally vulnerable than we think we are. No one thinks it's going to happen to them, you know. In my experience, from what I've learned, and all the people that have reached out to me, it doesn't matter how smart you are, it doesn't matter where you were educated, it doesn't matter what family you were brought up in, where you've travelled, how intuitive you think you are. It can happen to anyone, because these nefarious characters are professionals and they're very, very good at what they do. They're psychological weapons. And, you know, we have to be on the lookout. We have to be really vigilant.
Thanks to Tracy for telling us her story. True Crime Conversations is a Mamma Mia podcast Hosted and produced by me, Gemma Barth, and Tali Blackman, with audio design by Jacob Round. Thanks so much for listening. I'll be back next week with another true crime conversation.